Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonicist. We're going to feature something a little bit different today. I have been very guilty of not having considered the women of this period in any proper detail. And I reckon today I'm going to get a bit of a bashing round the head from today's guest for having failed to do so, but we will put that right. I am joined by Samantha Jolley, who is Assistant Curator at the Royal Engineers Museum in Gillingham. She's a trustee of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity and is talking to me today about her MA thesis, which was entitled Wives, Whores and Amazons, Women in the Napoleonic Era Armies. Sam, welcome to the Napoleonicist. Well, welcome back, in fact, because folks will remember that you absolutely stormed it with your suggestion about blockades being the most significant naval event or thing that happened during the Napoleonic era. People absolutely went to town on that on social media. Good to have you back. How are you doing?
Hello, thanks for having me back. I'm good, thank you. Looking forward to being able to talk a little bit more about my comfort field rather than a topic I'm not too familiar with.
I'm always very conscious on this podcast of the need to try and make sure that the women who are doing brilliant research in this field end up getting the platform that they absolutely have a right to. And what I'm often quite irritated by is this kind of perception that certain people have of, oh, women don't do military history. And I'm enormously tempted to ask a very kind of sarky question about, so Sam, as a woman, why are you studying wars? Because everybody knows that military history is just about men and men studying men. I don't know if you necessarily want to answer that, but feel free to tear apart the patriarchy, because I do often enough.
Funnily enough, I did used to get that question all the time when I was younger. But it's not like women haven't been doing military history for years. So one of the people who got me into the field was Elizabeth Greenhill with her great work on the Somme in the First World War. And it's definitely not new that women are doing military history. And it's kind of maybe a bit cliche that the thing I'm talking about today is women in military history. I don't just do women, but this is one of the topics close to my heart because I very much enjoyed putting the women back into the Napoleonic Wars, because they are there in Legion. They're not necessarily there in as much Legion as the men, but they are definitely there.
It's funny, I was talking on another podcast a few weeks back about the study of history and about the need to sort of what I described as put the humanity back into history. And I think in the military context, perhaps we're starting to do better on the social side and starting to understand the psychology and some of the social impacts of war. But what we don't do as well, in my opinion, is putting the women, particularly into the Napoleonic era. And there are examples and exceptions to that. We'll no doubt talk about some of the books and some of the work that has been written. But this is going to be a really interesting one because I have always been frustrated by the lack of coverage and the sort of fleeting glimpses that we get of women who play an absolutely pivotal role in the course of these conflicts. So touching on that historiography element, let's start with sort of the history of women in the Napoleonic era armies, because knowledge about these women isn't mainstream, I think it's fair to say. Their presence is sort of vaguely acknowledged, but it's usually just a really kind of frustrating single line and then people move on. So what's the traditional perception and what's actually been said about their experience?
So as you can probably imagine, a lot of the earlier books about the Napoleonic Wars, sort of the 19th century text, they don't really comment on them too much. They, as you say, they have sort of a line, they acknowledge they existed, but this also isn't really not to be expected, because they are, on the whole, most of the women who are camp followers and battalion wives, they are common soldiers' wives, and the common soldiers themselves don't necessarily get a huge amount of space in these Napoleonic histories of the 19th century. They are operational and tactical and political. And the French wrote a little bit more about their contingères, who are the official battalion wives in the French army, but not really hugely until sort of 1913. So 100 years after the period, there's an entire book about them by Raoul Bryce. But even he says they're popular in France, and he acknowledges how important they are. But he also feels that he needs to call them women of half virtue and masculine. So even though there is an entire book dedicated to them, it is still very sort of apologetic about them, and it still very much demeans them. So whilst it applauds their importance, it demeans them as women and their place in society. And as you can then imagine, sort of in the 1960s, with the sort of populist movement towards personal stories and also the rise in feminist history, there is then a slight increase in these stories, but mainly actually soldier women, because they defy gender norms, because they're exciting, and they go into histories or as well anthologies of extraordinary women and women who break down the patriarchy, rather than as women within the military in the Napoleonic Wars. And they are treated as special and extraordinary, and they're taken away from the context in which they were fighting. But with this onset of feminine history, the camp followers kind of get neglected a bit, because they don't challenge the gender norms. They are there because of their husbands, or they are there because they followed the army and followed the men, and they cook and they clean. They're not fighting against the patriarchy, which actually, as I'll talk about later, most soldier women weren't anyway. But they're not defying the gender norm, and therefore they're not this sort of political figure for these anthologies. But a really, really great book that came out in sort of around about 2005 was Thomas Cardozo wrote about the contingères from the old regime through to 1906, when the end of the role for women came. The logistical side was formalized into the male soldier part of the army. And he really did a big study on all of the contingères of the Vendières. There hasn't been really as much of a similar British one. Annabel Venning wrote a really good book about Following the Drum, about soldiers' wives. But apart from that, there hasn't been huge amounts of studies. Since I did the bulk of my research, Charles Esdale has written about Spanish women in the Peninsula, but as that happened off the bulk of my research, I can't really comment too much about that. But one that I forgot to mention, in the 30s, before all the feminism, a little anthology on important women came out, and by O.P. Gilbert. And what I find really interesting in this one is that he couldn't accept that female soldiers could still be feminine. And he had a huge surprise that the French Phoenix sisters could both be successful at making prisoners and killing men. And I've always found that very interesting, this contrast between a fighting woman and a woman, and how they can't be the same thing.
Right. Okay, so his fragile sense of masculinity to one side. I'm also interested in the way in which these women are represented in kind of the popular kind of ways of thinking about this period. And I know you and I have been talking over a few days as we've been planning this podcast, and you've been showing me a curious French, what's the word for it? It's like a comic book, really, isn't it? It's almost like Marvel, but for the Napoleonic Wars. But the representations of women in that, from certainly from what I've seen, from what you've sent me, are well, they're borderline porn. Well, no, they're not even borderline pornographic. They are pornographic, frankly. So, you know, we're talking about the 1930s and this guy kind of not being able to get his head around the fact that a woman might want to join up and fight. In this comic book, we'll talk about the particulars in a second, you've got this kind of perception that women are just there to start a family and haven't got any kind of notion of anything beyond that. Has much kind of changed in terms of perception? Are we actually kind of waking up to the realities, or is there still a huge amount that's left to do there?
When it comes to the camp followers and soldiers' wives in popular culture, they tend to be either victims or plunderers. But Teresa Figer, who I will talk a lot more about later, my favourite female French soldier, who is what you were referring to with the graphic novel. So her story, which I will touch more on probably later, is very much one of a female soldier fighting in her own right for her own reasons after an initial signing up initially for a family member. And this graphic novel, it's a really lovely graphic novel, and I love the fact that a female soldier from the Napoleonic Wars has a graphic novel. That in itself is lovely, and I rushed out to buy it the minute it came out. And it came out in 2014, so this is very recent. This is not some historical representation when women are nothing but sex objects. But yes, in scenes where it's found out she's a woman by the Republicans, there is her lying half naked on the floor, and then there's scenes of her in a prison hulk later. And just to make sure everyone who, even though they've read the graphic novel and know she's a woman, just to make sure everyone knows she's a woman, she's the only one sat in this prison hulk with just one breast hanging out very delicately. So there is definitely still this element, I think, sometimes of people being sexualized, women being sexualized from this period, which I imagine in some contexts is fine, like in the TV dramatizations of Sharp, Teresa, the Spanish partisan, she is sexy because she's sexy, not because she's got anything hanging out or anything. So there are definitely ways to make these women feminine and awesome, but without the classic sexualization that unfortunately some of the popular culture has.
Absolutely. There's a whole conversation to be had there about representations of women in Sharp, which we will probably avoid and perhaps save for another day. I want to set what we're looking at today in a bit of kind of broader context, because it's all very well to look at a specifically military environment, but that brings its own kind of unique factors. So when we think about society at large, and obviously class has a role to play in terms of societal expectations, what are the sort of ideals that people are projecting onto women and encouraging women to aspire to during this period?
Not to fight in wars as a start. So the Enlightenment had made prevalent the view that women were less intelligent than men and not fit for the same roles in society. In France, 80 to 85% of 18th century women were peasants working in the fields, and women all over Europe worked in bakeries, inns, taverns, and the clothing industries if they were sort of the working lower classes. I focus particularly on France there because a lot of what I'm going to be saying today will focus on French women. Women, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's widely published works, had a moral influence in society as a mother, and this was an ideal taken on by the Jacobins during the French Revolution. The moral degradation of society could be fixed by mothers instructing children to behave virtuously. And therefore, from the very start of the revolution, the Jacobins had sort of sidelined women into this role in their minds. The French Revolution, however, had rallied the common people into action, and it had raised the issues of women's rights, whether the people in charge of the revolution wanted it to or not. Women were excluded from the fancy clubs where the large political discussions were held, but in the markets and the streets of Paris, the women not only rallied, but they led. In the October March of 1789, the women in the angry women in the market rallied a huge number of themselves, and they stormed the king's palace because they had not only were already angry over food prices, but they'd heard the king had stamped on a tricolor cockade. And on the 28th of August 1789, the National Convention dropped the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man, seeking to equalise the rights of the active citizen. So what's important here, why this is relevant, is because men who paid taxes were active citizens, men who owned land were active citizens, men in the military were active citizens, but women were not. Women were passive citizens. But many, many women in Paris particularly believed that because they had helped start the revolution, they had continued the revolution, they had fought, they had helped drag the king back to Paris after he fled, they were worried. They thought they needed to be able to bear arms in order to defend themselves. They didn't think they were going to be safe. But also, this was very much hijacked by women who thought they could try and get some rights. And women who could bear arms would become an active citizen because men in the military were active citizens. So to the newly formed National Convention, it was more than just a case of letting women have guns. It was whether the women having guns would then be an active citizen. And so women were barred from being in the army. And this is it was a standard. I say that as if it's some kind of surprise, but obviously it's not a standard for women to be in the army at that time, but it's also wider within the country of France. Women are being barred from taking up arms because they are worried that they will become active citizens if they do this. So on one side, we get the Society of the Revolutionary Republican Women asking for the right to bear arms and defend Paris, and therefore for them it's about becoming active citizens. They have an ulterior motive. And on the other side, we're going to be getting female soldiers who have gone to fight for reasons we'll go on to in a moment, who are then getting sent home because of the fears in Paris about these political women who aren't even in the front line anyway.
That sounds really quite messy. And what's also quite sad is how long these kind of perceptions continue, particularly obviously across ancien regime Europe into kind of 19th century Europe. But I mean, in France, they're still talking about public and private spheres and how men have a duty to occupy the public and women should focus on the private, that last all the way up into the 1920s, 30s, even arguably into the 40s. So, I mean, this has a long legacy, two fingers to the Enlightenment, frankly, for the suggestion that women are less intelligent than men. There are a few groups that you cover in your research, and I want to start with the one that I think listeners are perhaps most likely to know about, which is the camp followers, because we just kind of have this thing, perhaps I'm kind of being too Anglo-centric in my perception there, but we know about camp followers and their roles in helping the kind of the internal economy of the regiment. So who were these women, first of all? What do we know about their origins and their lives before they joined the army?
Well, there is no easy answer to that because there is no clear documentation really for most camp followers, because as as you can predict, someone who is an unofficial camp follower isn't going to have a record. Even official battalion wives don't really hold a record of them with the British Army. With the French Army, there are records of the cantonnières, also sometimes known as vivandiers, who were the official battalion wives, who we will talk about in a minute. But with unofficial camp followers, there's two sorts of main types. There's the daughters of soldiers who were either already their mum and the family were already official battalion wives going with them, and therefore they married the daughters who are around. And then there's also women who were just picked up in Spain and Flanders, and then obviously in the French armies, they also had unofficial camp followers who they would have picked up around. This is definitely, it's very important, I think, for people to recognise that when the war in the peninsula was happening, France are the bad guy, but it's not like Spanish women are only going off with the British people. They're not just going off with the hero Brits. They are also going off with the French army. There are hordes of Spanish women who are either falling in love with French men or they're following the French army because there are opportunities to try and marry someone or to get food or to make money off of them or to haul themselves out, however is best to survive.
Yeah, absolutely right. I'm not going to argue with you on that one. And of course, there's a huge backlash eventually. You kind of see this with the whole Afrancesado movement. That was an attempt at a Spanish accent. Apologies, that was appalling. But that whole kind of movement receives a huge backlash, initially from sort of the guerrillas, but then in time, just kind of more generally in Spain, as the French are pushed back. So it's a really important point that you make. But equally, as you say, a lot of your work is kind of French orientated. So when you have these armies moving into Central Europe and then on into Eastern Europe, you must see the same kinds of things. Is there a kind of resistance or a kind of a hierarchy based on nationality that you see within these armies? Because there's a lot of, there's embryonic nationalism for a start. There's a lot of kind of snobbish tendencies to look down their noses at other nations. You see this in the British Army, where they automatically think they're better than the French. In the French Army, and I'm thinking here of Michael Hughes's work in Forging Napoleon's Grande Armée, he talks about this kind of culture of sexual conquest being conflated with a culture of conquest. And that kind of sense of you've got French people and you've got others, and others, you can kind of do what you like with them, inverted commas. So do you see those attitudes played out when, in terms of the interactions that these women have when they join the French army and they're not French themselves? Or do we just not have the records for that? Or is it a case that actually for a soldier, they fall in love with who they fall in love with, and they couldn't really give a monkeys about all of these other things at play?
On a wider scale, I can't comment, purely based on lack of evidence. But there is one case I think here that would go nicely with this question, and that is a cantonniere called Florencia, and she was Spanish. And to give a brief introduction to what a cantonniere is a highly sought after official position with the French army. There are only about 3 or 4 per battalion. They have official licenses to plunder, pillage, sell their goods to the men. They're highly respected within the troops. They make a lot of money. They're trusted. Usually, they're highly respected from all ranks, all the way from the bottom to the generals. And this woman, Florencia, Spanish woman, wasn't even officially married to her French soldier. They just had some kind of quasi, we've been together for a couple of years, we are married. She's applied to be a cantonniere. And in, I can't remember which battle it is, but she is out in the front lines and she is trying to steal some of her wares, but also she has a gun and she's helping to sort of shoot some of the enemy. And she gets her thumb shot off and she faints through blood loss and shock. And one of the French soldiers who isn't her husband is nowhere in this context. He is somewhere else in the regiment fighting the battle. She's off on her own, doing her own thing as a cantonniere. And this other soldier who sees her as a friend, he sees her faint and he wants to help her, but he's shot in the leg and he can't get there in time. And another soldier that he doesn't recognize, it's someone in his regiment, but he's not friends with him, instantly just picks her up and carries her back to the line. And she's this Spanish woman who's not even technically legally married to someone in the regiment.
It's interesting how, we as historians can come up with all of these theories and then actually you deal with the gritty reality. And this is why I love that gritty reality, and it just kind of blows all of these perceptions that we create apart. So you talk about the cantonnières and what they do. What else do we know about women who are attached to these units? And I'm thinking particularly about battalion wives here.
So with the British, they are pretty much exactly what you are going to stereotypically believe they are there for. So about 6 wives per battalion are allowed to go abroad with the unit, and they are there to cook, to clean, and to sew. That is their role. And this is what I find, and this is where I think why a lot of British perceptions of women in the peninsula have sort of slipped a bit to them being not important or to forgetting they're there, because they did such mundane tasks as that. And then you compare it to the French model, where they are these cantonnières. They have this official role, but it's so much more than that. They aren't just cooking, they aren't just cleaning, they aren't just sewing, and they aren't just selling. They aren't just going to plunder and find items to sell to everyone. They are also bankers. like sort of quasi bankers, not official bankers. You've got records of officers and men borrowing money off of them, but also before battles giving them their money to look after. And then they kind of become their sort of quasi heir as well. If the officer or the soldier dies in battle, then the cantonnier gets to keep the money, so then they profit. And then if they survive, obviously they give it back because they were just looking after it. And I find this very, very interesting because the British Army, I don't think the officers and men would even trust the soldiers' wives with their kind of like, I don't know, spoons, let alone their money.
Yeah, the British side is really interesting because it's quite, when you do get references to them, it's quite clear that without the battalion wives basically do what the hell they want, and it annoys the hell out of Wellington. So there's a woman called Bridget Skiddy. I believe she's an Irish woman, and Wellington issues an order that the battalion wives aren't allowed to march in advance of the army's line of march. I think they're on a retreat actually, because there's an issue with the fact that the women head out early, they hit the campsite, they scour the local landscape for food, particularly bread. And the idea is that they're making sure that their men have got something to eat when they come in from the day's march or the day's skirmishing, whatever it might be. And so a provost marshal is told, look, you need to do something about this. And so he lies in wait and he shoots one of the battalion mules. He gets the ultimate verbal battering from this woman. And the next day, she just carries on as normal, because they have this kind of sense of kind of commitment to their spouse. And it is, as you say, kind of tied up with those gender tropes that we associate these women with. But they are absolutely vital, because they're helping to make sure that everybody gets something to eat. And yes, it creates a headache for Wellington, but Wellington's got that headache anyway because he can't supply his men well enough. But yeah, they're crucial. I want to tap into the daily life element here. What do these women kind of see and experience, and how much danger are they in working within a war zone? I mean, you've mentioned about the woman who gets her thumb shut off. Is that kind of unusual? You've also got this fact that they're in an environment where it's all men, and all of the dangers that come with that. So what are their lives like day to day?
So Biddy Skiddy actually is a nice way in, because she's one of my little heroes, because she was renowned for being able to procure food for her husband Dan, even in the hardest of times. But also she has one of the it's a very symbolic story, I think. She noticed that her husband was flagging. He, in the peninsula, he couldn't go on. He absolutely could not go on. And she said, how about I carry your pack for you? Obviously, in more of a 1800s Victorian, Peninsular War accent. And he said, no, I will get done for desertion. I will get tried for desertion if you take the pack. And she said, and I will take you. And she took him with his pack attached and just carried him and his pack in order to keep him surviving. And so obviously to the rest of the unit, her contribution was probably minimal, but to Dan, she saved his life. If he'd fallen behind, he wouldn't have survived. So that is one of the best stories I find of British soldiers' wives in the peninsula. But more general experiences, it's with the British Army, there are definitely stories of en masse. The camp followers tend to be seen as getting in the way. And there are stories of them struggling to get across rivers, and the rest of the army just not wanting to help. They're often seen as a burden and impeding the speed of the army. For example, George Bell classed them as a multitude of soldiers' wives stuck to the army like bricks, and averse to all military discipline. They impeded our progress at times very much. But George Bell is the exact man who I learned about Biddy Skiddy from, and he thought that she was the best woman alive. So it's very much, individual women are getting great reputations for their individual acts towards husbands. The unofficial ones are just swarms, apparently. And a lot of women I might be prejudiced here, but they have a reputation for drunkenness, and I kind of understand why. If you're out in a combat zone and you are not an official wife and you have very few rations and you're getting stuck in rivers and no one's helping you, and you've had to give birth by the roadside and no one's helped you, and the army's marched on, wouldn't you want a reprieve? It's not like the soldiers weren't also getting in trouble for the occasional drunkenness either. It's not like this was a solely female vice and the women are hoarding alcohol up their skirts and just denying the men. But one drunk wife who could not be encouraged to move when the army was moving was just left in the church she was hiding in, and then apparently the French threw her out the bell tower. Not quite the happy ending for her there. But also another huge theme with British wives in particular is plundering. And this happened on both sides, but a key thing I think is that with the French, the cantonnières, when they plundered, were plundering to sell back to the troops, so it benefited the troops, so their plundering wasn't plundering. Plundering is only plundering in the French's eyes if it's not going back to them, otherwise it's just procurement. But the British women, when plundering, weren't always even safe from their own side. There's a story of a Portuguese camp follower who was shot by an outraged British soldier, and he was outraged because she was trying to finish off a French soldier to rob him. So she was trying to kill a member of the enemy, and yet the British still killed her because she was going to kill a member of the enemy who they'd already injured in the battle. It makes very little sense.
Well, there's a complex moral dynamic going on there, isn't there, which is partly about once you've rendered somebody incapable of fighting, do you leave them? But that, yeah, there's a whole thing there. It's interesting what you say about the drunkenness thing. The men are absolutely appalling when it comes to drunkenness. I'm not being funny. The number of trials I come across where men are effectively drunk and disorderly is huge. They're giving these people booze as part of their daily ration. Alcoholism is absolutely rife. In fact, in Gibraltar, they have an absolute nightmare trying to kind of clamp down on sales of booze to soldiers. So the irony of kind of perceiving these women as, oh, they're all drunken all the time. Well, so are you. Get a grip. But the India comparison is kind of interesting as well when it comes to people going, oh, well, all these women getting in the way. Because the armies in India were, when it came to camp followers, were about 3 or 4 or 5 times the size when it came to moving actually much smaller forces. So it's interesting that you get all of these kind of these aspersions attached to them that just don't bear out in reality.
Yes, there are on the other side though also the occasional story of soldiers helping the women. So there are also I can't recall when it was, but a group of drunken women in one town, a cavalry officer sent the cavalry back to save them. So it's not ever, with any kind of history, it's never ever a flat out across the board, we hate all women. Because as I've already said, it's not that the British Army hated all women that were with them. They got annoyed at the unofficial women. The official women were there and the official women were allowed to be there. And therefore they definitely didn't have this kind of great status, but they didn't have a disdain. And I find that quite sad that that's the way to view it, that they weren't viewed with disdain. Whereas in the French army, they were actually quite revered. The official women, the cantonnières, were revered so much that in Prussian Poland, one officer went fishing in a captured town one day, and instead of catching fish, he found a body, and they carried on pulling them up, and there were 38 bodies. There were 37 French soldiers and 1 cantonnière. And in punishment to the town, the French hanged 38 members of that town. He hanged in retribution a member of the town for every single soldier and a cantonnière. And whilst that's not a nice story at all, I can't, if there was a British comparison, I can't see the British taking out a retribution on a fallen soldier's wife. the only ones I could see them possibly seeking retribution for are officers' wives, which I haven't actually touched on at all yet, because they're sort of living a very different life. The most famous of which, like, I can never pronounce her name, Joanna Smith. Soldiers and officers, every time she wanted to get off her horse, were running to help her down and sort of basically laying their cloaks in front of her chivalrously. Whereas you've got women years before in the retreat to Corunna who are dying by the roadside, giving birth on their own. French soldiers are finding dead British women lying by the roadside. In one really horrible, harrowing account, I'm sorry everyone, but they find this dead woman with her screaming newborn baby just lying there. She just gave birth on her own, died in the freezing cold, and this poor baby is just there.
Yeah, if you want an indication of how badly the British treat the unofficial battalion wives, i.e. the women who aren't officially on the battalion strength, at the end of the Peninsular War, when they are marching the battalions to ports to embark them for either service in the War of 1812 or to return to England, part of the reason you see a huge uptick in desertion, and we're talking figures that the British Army hasn't seen at any point in the Peninsular War, more than sort of double, perhaps even triple their standard desertion rates. The reason for that is because the British Army refuses to take back the unofficial battalion wives. And so you see a kind of movement amongst some of the soldiers where they think, to hell with this, and they run off with their spouses. And as you say, there's a very different kind of culture here. Let's stay with the battalions, the officers' wives, for a second. You mentioned Joanna Smith. She's 15 on that horrible night at the Siege of Badajoz, where she meets Harry Smith and, is it Jonathan Leach or John Kincaid? I forget. I think it's Kincaid. And they both basically try to woo her. So I always feel quite uneasy about the fact, and I know that's modern sensibilities and different times and different kind of standards, but I always feel quite uneasy about the fact that she's a teenager when she gets, inverted commas, swept off her feet, if indeed that is how it happened. But there was genuine affection there. So tell us more about the experience of officers' wives and, you know, the way in which that kind of differed, aside from the obvious thing about affluence.
So officers' wives are an odd one because they're always treated with a huge amount more respect because of the British class system than the other battalion wives. But in May 1813, Major Augustus Fraser asked, what will these ladies do? And his question is not unfounded, because the answer essentially is nothing. They don't do the cooking, they don't do the cleaning, they don't do the sewing, they don't go plundering to feed their husbands because they don't need to. And if anything, a lot of the time they were also just, their luggage would get in the way. However, I know that sounds very, very judgmental of me, but there are instances where some notable women did ride out into the battlefield with their husbands. So George Bell recalled the wife of Colonel Delbiac riding out at Salamanca. Apparently, the delicate and beautiful wife of Colonel Delbiac braved the dangers and privations of 2 campaigns with the fortitude and patience of her sex. In the Battle of Salamanca, forgetful of herself, she clearly was forgetting how to be a woman, because women don't fight, remember everybody, supported by strong affection for her gallant knight, this man who is her protector, even though she has chosen to go over to the peninsula with him, exposing herself to imminent peril. There was no man present that day fighting the battles of his country who did not fight with more than double enthusiasm, seeing that fair lady in such danger on the battlefield. So in her case, she inspired the men around her, but obviously, according to Bell, she didn't necessarily do much in her own right. She forgot herself, forgot how to be a woman, and inspired the men around her, when in reality, she probably actually, she wouldn't just be riding around the battlefield doing nothing. I can imagine she probably actually would have got up, picked up a rifle and done something useful.
I'm not sure on this podcast we've ever had a historical burn, but I think we've just had that, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how many episodes we're in now, 125, 130, but I'm not sure any of the people that we've cited have ever been torn apart in quite such fashion. But sorry, I interrupted you, Sam. Carry on.
Imagine the softest sheets you've ever felt. Now imagine them getting even softer over time. That's what you'll feel with Boll & Branch's organic cotton sheets. In a recent customer survey, 96% replied that Boll & Branch sheets get softer with every wash. Start getting your best night's sleep in these sheets that get softer and softer for years to come. Try their sheets with a 30-night guarantee. Plus, get 15% off your first order at bollandbranch.com. Code BUTTERY. Exclusions apply. See site for details.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Oh no, I was just gonna bring up another lady who also rode into battle, which is, again, these women, these officers' wives riding into battle is not something that's sort of commonly known about. I'm sure a couple of your listeners probably do, because they like the Napoleonic Wars and study it a bit. But Lady Charlotte Harley rode with her husband into battle throughout the entire Peninsula and Waterloo campaigns. And the wife of Major John James actively joined her husband's cavalry charges and was nearly taken prisoner. And she was only saved because she pulled out a pistol in her own defense, not because any soldier came to save her. These women weren't in great number. They didn't swoop into the battlefield and save the day at any point, but they still have stories that are just sort of universally neglected.
So let's stay with this idea of battalion wives. How does this vary across armies of other nationalities? Because we've talked quite a bit here about the British example. What's the story with the French system and with other European systems, if we know about those?
So as I've already touched upon, the French cantonniere system was incredibly effective. It fully integrated these official wives as merchants, which it kind of recognized their significance. It recognized that having women with the battalion could be useful, but it also meant it freed up men to not be focusing on that. So with the Ancien Regime, there were such a thing. They were called vivandiers at the time, and they were always married to a I don't know how to pronounce the male version. It's basically vivandier without an E on the end, so vivandeur. So there was always a female vivandier could not just be one in her own right. She always had to be married to a male version. And then with the First Republic, regulations changed, and any official battalion wife could apply to become a cantonniere. And this gave women sort of a modicum of independence. And also with the Ancien Regime, the vivandiers, cantonnières, they tended to not leave the baggage trade. They were more merchants outside of a battle. But as soon as they were permitted their own independence, and this probably also would coincide with the patriotism of the First Republic and defending the revolution, but cantonnières were suddenly running onto the battlefields as well. And part of it was definitely a sense of business acumen. They wanted to run out into the field and sell brandy to men who needed courage, men who were a bit scared. But it wasn't always that, because they didn't always sell the brandy. Sometimes they gave it away for free. And sometimes they were shouting at the men, "Oh, pay for it tomorrow," knowing full well that many of these men may not be alive to pay for it tomorrow. So there's definitely there an element of independence, and definitely there an element of patriotism that probably developed over time until in the Peninsula they might not necessarily have been quite so fighting for the Republic, but they were definitely more independent. And as I said earlier, the cantonnières were even bankers. But another really, really key part of being a cantonnière was that the very successful ones had tents. They had tents, and they created a social hub for the soldiers. It's something that you definitely don't see in the British Army at all. And I really, really cannot be stressed enough how important that little social centre, because these cantonnières would have tents in an army where the rest of the soldiers didn't necessarily have tents and bivouacs, and this would be a warm, dry place with food that soldiers could buy and brandy that soldiers could buy. In a wet environment, in a cold environment, it would have just a huge amount for morale.
I want to move on to a topic here that I know is going to particularly fascinate our listeners, not least because we tend not to talk about this very much, but your research has uncovered details about women actually serving in the ranks, i.e. fighting. They are soldiers. So do we have any evidence of women being actively recruited into the army, or are we still kind of within France? You mentioned about, concerns about women in Paris and them pushing for rights. So I'm guessing not in the French system, but in other nations, do we see women being called upon to fight in some form?
So the soldier women are very, very close to my heart, particularly the French ones, the femmes soldats. But first of all, I'm going to quickly mention the British Army, because that is probably it's the quickest to talk about, because fundamentally, as you can imagine, the British Army do not want women to dress up as men and to fight for them. There was a woman called Sarah Roberts who served during not only the American War of Independence, but also in the 1790s. And she was injured, I think, in the early 1800s in the Flanders campaign. And as soon as they found out she was a woman, they kicked her out. So she was in the British Army for 22 years, and she was kicked out without a single pension. So having been kicked out, she was then completely denied any kind of pension and just completely kicked out straight away with no acknowledgement of her 22 years service. This is definitely not a rarity for the British Army. So there are very, very few recorded in the even before the Napoleonic Wars. In the entirety of the 18th century, there were a couple of others. A woman named Phoebe Hessel, who signed up because she wanted to follow her husband at the time and remarried. And so usually the British women supposedly tended to go because of love, because of a husband. And it's not just British women in the British Army that get kicked out either. Joanna Stain was serving in the King German Legion. She was injured in Portugal and she was sent home after 15 years of service. Every British woman that was found was sent home. The only woman there's recorded evidence of who fought for Britain and was not made to go home was a French woman. Her name was Madame de Benes, and she was in the Damas Legion. So it was a French legion that then fought, a French royalist legion that then fought under the flag. So she was kind of a safe thing because she wasn't British. She was the kind of weird anomaly in the French legion. So therefore it didn't really matter to the British.
That's pretty piss poor, and particularly considering the first lady that you mentioned was injured. And so therefore, and don't quote me on this because I'm not good on the Chelsea pension records, but if you're wounded and it affects your day-to-day life, the men were entitled to Chelsea pensions, whether as in pensioners or out pensioners. So that's, I can't say I'm surprised, but that is pretty appalling.
Yes, but the thing I find very interesting is that with the longevity of these Sarah Roberts service in particular, the 22 years of service, I find it very hard to believe that the men around her and her commanding officer didn't know. So I have no evidence for this. All I can go by is the fact that I'm a woman, and I know that I would not be able to hide the things that make me a woman from a group of men for 22 years in a scenario where you have very little privacy, even bathing, going to the latrine, certain monthly cycle issues. I do not believe that they didn't know. And I reckon that to the commanding officer in this case, it was, this soldier is good at being a soldier. And then suddenly she's injured and other people above them find out and he's like, oh no, I never knew. I promise I never knew.
Complete mystery to me, but I completely agree with you. But also it taps into something that we were talking about or touching on earlier about, for the average individual in the ranks, do they really care about some of these things? We were talking about nationality and questions about nationality. And when it comes to fighting, and this is where Ed Koss's work comes into play, when he talks about kind of primary group cohesion and individuals, mess groups sitting down and trusting one another. If she's prepared to fight as hard as every other bloke in that mess group, they don't care. She's got her back, so they've got her back. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're absolutely right on that. What about the French example?
So France is very interesting because in the French archives there is documentary evidence of 4 definite female soldiers. But as of April 1793, when a decree was released to send all women home who were following the army, who were either unofficial camp followers or female soldiers were specifically mentioned in this decree. That's how prolific they were. They estimated about 300 women were fighting for the First Republic in 1793, which is a huge amount considering they're not permitted. This isn't a case of women are being encouraged to go to the front and look, 300 of them have decided to go. This is in a society where women are actively not allowed into the army. And they're not just going and fighting alongside the men as women, as cantonnières. Some of them are going as women in a uniform and outright saying, I'm a woman and I put on this uniform. But a lot of them are also going pretending to be men and being found out. And there are three kind of main reasons why these women are going. One is very predictably love. And by love, I don't always necessarily mean, oh, my husband, my sweetheart. Sometimes it's a brother or a father. It is an important male in their life. So it's definitely not just romantic love. Sometimes it is familial love as well. There is poverty, because 3 meals a day and a regularly well-paid job is just as enticing to a poor woman as it is to a poor man. Just because it's not an acceptable path for them or a legitimate path for them doesn't mean there aren't a few women. Again, this is a very small minority, but for those women who do decide that it's worth trying, that it is a very valid path for them to try and follow. And the other is freedom. And for some of those people, it was freedom from a restricted life. And for some of them, it was freedom from execution. So one of my favorite people ever, not just favorite female soldier, favorite people ever, is a woman named Teresa Figa. And she covers 2 of these. So she originally went to war for the Royalists, and she went to war because her uncle was a captain in the artillery for the Royalist army. And when their unit got attacked, she got slightly injured, not drastically, but slightly injured. And the Republican Army were taking her captive, and they were going to execute her as a revolutionary when she said, "Whoa, I'm a woman. I'm going to save myself here. Look at me. I'm a woman. Please don't kill me. I'm here because I was fighting with my uncle. I didn't have a huge amount of choice in this. I don't actually really believe in what I'm fighting for. I'm doing it to survive." And the commanding officer of the Republicans thought she was a hilarious novelty. So he took her on as a woman, but not as a woman. So he knew she was a woman, but he encouraged her to pretend to be a man still. And a few months in, he had an angry townsfolk person bring his daughter in and say, "That soldier raped my daughter and now she is pregnant." And the colonel, the Republican colonel, had a great field day going, "Oh, ha, 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 I can promise you this is absolutely impossible. That soldier did not rape your daughter." And the daughter's going, you doubt me, you doubt my virtue. And so they summoned in a soldier, which was Teresa Figa, under her male name. And they said, "Go on, prove why you couldn't have molested this woman." And so she just takes her uniform off and goes, "Look, I've got boobs. I'm not a man. It is impossible for me to have got your daughter pregnant." And from that moment on, she just serves sort of as an open woman. And it's very bizarre because at the time, in 1793, when the decree sent women home, a lot of units did send their women home, but a lot of unit commanders also didn't, because it was not allowed for them to keep them, but they decided that woman fought as well as the man next to them, and there was no point in sending a good soldier home Some of them, yes, some of them sent them home. It's not like there was a universal love of all these female soldiers, but a lot of them didn't send them home. So in this context, you're not allowed to be a female soldier, and yet Teresa Figa was not only kept on, but every now and then she would retire, and then she'd get re-enlisted into another regiment. There was always this re-enlistment of her. And at Toulon, she served with Napoleon and really didn't like him. She thought he was a bit of a knob, which I'm yeah, Zach's laughing, but I'm a bit sad because I'm a Napoleon fan. And
this is true.
a few but one of my favorite Teresa Figa stories is she is this incredibly badass woman. She fights in a lot of battles. She saves a French commander in one of them. She has horses shot from underneath her twice. And then the one story in her memoir that she says really sticks out to her and haunted her sleep for a couple of years was this young Russian guy that she killed. And she killed him because as she was riding towards him, he shot at her. And it wasn't that he shot at her that she killed him. She killed him because the shot grazed the tiger skin on her dragoon helmet, and she was furious. Teresa wasn't the only female soldier to distinguish herself in the wars. At Jemappes in Belgium, 1792, Felicity Ferning single-handedly rescued a French wounded officer, whilst her sister on the other side of the battlefield killed 2 Hungarian grenadiers and captured the commander of an enemy battalion. In 1807, a woman called Madame Poncet, I don't know her first name, killed a Russian captain and rescued a leaderless cavalry unit. So she rescued the leaderless cavalry unit. So she rescued it and took it over and got it back to the rest of the troops. In the same year, she was shot under the right armpit, and having bound it up, she continued to take 6 prisoners by herself. At Antwerp, a woman named Mathies seized an Austrian Imperial Eagle, and a woman named simply as de Gressin returned from the war with only 1 ear, scars on her face and thighs. And so this implies either she was constantly in the middle of the action or was very bad at dodging bullets. So the femme soldats fought hard. They were there for a reason. If they weren't good soldiers, if they didn't fight hard, they would have been sent home or married off to someone and become a soldier's wife. I don't have a huge amount of stories from other nationalities, but they are there. So one of the most famous Spanish women, Agustina Zaragoza, she was at the siege of Zaragoza. She was carrying ammunition to the Spanish artillery when all of them were killed by one explosion. And so she, as the wall breached and the French started to come through, she fired the cannon that had already been loaded and killed all of the French in one go. And that bought the Spanish time to hold back from the French. And she became a national hero as well as just a local hero. She was given a rank in the Spanish army. But what was very interesting, I found with her, is that when she went aboard a naval ship, a British naval ship, for dinner, they acknowledged her military rank. So the British acknowledged their own women. Any British woman in the army gets sent home in disgrace as an abomination with no pension and no pay. But foreign women are respected versus their rank. And when Teresa Figa got captured by the British. She got captured by the British, I think, in the Peninsula, actually. And originally, she was made to wear a dress. So they refused to acknowledge that she was a soldier in that sense. But they did eventually acknowledge she was a soldier. But then when she got back to the UK, she wasn't put on a prison hulk with the rest of the soldiers. She was imprisoned in, well, sort of under house arrest in Portsmouth, and she raised rabbits. It's a bit of an odd imprisonment. And then she was repatriated in 1814. But the British definitely respected Agustina Zaragoza, which I find very strange. And another really interesting foreign example is Nadezhda Dorova with the Russian army. Now, she went to war. In her memoir, she very openly says it's because she wanted to live a freer life. She was the daughter of a major. She'd grown up surrounded by the military. She knew how to ride. She knew how to shoot. She married a man, had a kid, and decided this life isn't for me, and just packed up and signed up as a boy. And she, interestingly, does mention in her memoirs that she found it very, very hard to cover up being a woman because the fashion for the Russian men in her particular unit was to have big bushy moustaches, and she naturally couldn't grow that. and I think she got a transfer somewhere else. And then eventually the rumors had been going around the army that there was a female soldier in the ranks, and the Tsar found out, and he summoned her to the palace, and he was so amused by her that he sent her back as an official female soldier, but gave her the nickname Alexandros as a badge of honor.
So you were talking about the French army, and you touched on Napoleon. Napoleon, I will bash Napoleon relentlessly, but what I will say is that he was very good at motivating his men. And part of the way in which he achieved that motivation was through that interpersonal kind of relationship and that willingness to rub shoulders and tug people's ears and demonstrate that affection and forge those personal links. And that's part of why he was adored by so many of his troops. Do we have any stories of things like the Legion d'Honneur being handed to women? Because in one sense, you've said yourself, you've got women rallying regiments, you've got women taking Austrian standards. These are heroic acts that, if any man were responsible, they would be appearing before a general or a marshal or the emperor himself and receiving some kind of honor. So how does Napoleon deal with the fact that you've got a soldier here who is worthy of the honor, but at the same time, she's a woman, and so therefore kind of subverts the whole kind of gender norms of this period?
So I've always found it very, very hard to marry up Napoleon's very, very obvious misogyny in other areas with his attitude to women in the army, because there are no records of him sending a woman home. What there are records of is him kind of quasi-supporting certain individuals. So I cannot recall her name, but there was a woman on parade once. He found when he was inspecting the troops, there was a woman there, and he inquired with the commanding officer, this woman, why is there a woman here? What has she done? And after hearing some stories about her, he did give her the Legion d'Honneur off his breast, as he liked to do prolifically to other people. Also, Teresa Figa, to bang on about my hero again, in Egypt. So one thing that the female soldiers definitely did get a little bit of the predictable sexual harassment, definitely. And Teresa Figa got it relatively regularly, and at one point her colonel asked her if she'd be his mistress, and she got very, very upset. But in Egypt she got it a lot. I don't know what the difference was between them being in Egypt and being in the other combat zones. Maybe it was just the particular group of men she was with, and she had to get personal written protection from Napoleon, this man that she'd hated years before. They didn't get on when they met at Toulon, but suddenly in Egypt he was writing letters of personal protection. Do not harass Teresa Figa, or my wrath will be on you. So it's just always been very hard to marry up his misogyny, how he doesn't want women in politics. He thought that women messed up the Ancien regime. He didn't want Josephine to mess in politics. And yet he's not actively recruiting women for his army. That would be ludicrous. But he is definitely allowing these women to exist in his army. And there's definitely the argument that it was all for propaganda. He is obviously a very, very, very good man at identifying propaganda. But also, is it? Because in a world where you don't want women signing up, why would you be promoting women in the army? The purpose for that kind of tool would have been in 1793, save the Republic from the enemies around us, not so much in the Empire when he doesn't want women to be there.
Absolutely. A man full of contradictions was Napoleon, in my view, and there's another one, and it's a fascinating one. I want to end by just kind of thinking about what the future holds, because this has been fascinating, and I'm hoping that occasionally I bring guests on and we talk about, where does the study of this Napoleonic era need to go in the future? And it strikes me that this is one of those where we need to know more, or we should at least endeavor to try and learn more. So what do you think the future holds for understanding, firstly, of these women and their experiences, but also kind of their impact? Do you think there's more to potentially be discovered out there? I'm very conscious, and I'm sorry to bang on about Crime and Punishment again, but I'm conscious that I have two women of the nearly 9,500 trials that I've transcribed, and they're both described as, because the court-martial registers list the ranks, their rank is quite simply wife of, which tells you everything that you need to know about how the British Army kind of viewed these women and their social status. They are the wife of a particular private, almost as if they're, the husband's, the private's property. So there are other places that we could go in search of perhaps information about these women. So what are your thoughts on what else might be discovered, how it might be discovered, and the scope for more research in this area?
So the biggest challenge when I was trying to research this is that references to women, particularly in diaries and archival material, aren't catalogued as having references to women. So you have to read through an entire memoir and then maybe find a line or two about them. So I would have to go through, I'd have to buy or just find various memoirs, skim through them and hope for the best. And I think that, unfortunately, is how any future stories are going to continue to be found. So I'm really hoping that someone somewhere in their attic, I mean, I'm also an archivist, so this is my general hope in my life all the time, that someone's going to open their attic and find a fun new Napoleonic personal diary. And unfortunately for British women in particular, that's where the new stories are going to come from. The French archives, the French military archives, do have a fantastic set of official records of the cantonnières and of the female soldiers, and I neither have the linguistic skills, the time, or the money to go through all of them. So if anyone who is fluent in French, if they want to go and read through them and write a book on all these women for me, that would be great.
There you go. There's a PhD in prospect right there. Sam, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today. Remind people how they can kind of stay in touch with your work, and perhaps just kind of say a little bit about your day job, if you will, at the Royal Engineers Museum, and how people can kind of find out a bit more about the museum and what you actually do, if you will, day to day.
Of course. So you can find me on Twitter at @S_Jolley, and my surname is Jolley. So you can also find me at the Royal Engineers Museum, where I'm the assistant curator. We have a really, really great set of Napoleonic material. So we're the home of the famous Waterloo map, which was hurriedly put together through lots of scraps of existing sketches of the Waterloo area. And in the days before the battle, it was hastily put together and sent to Wellington as it is. It was allegedly also found on the body of the unconscious poor Delancey before he died. We have the letters of Fletcher before during the building of the lines of Torres Vedras. We have beautiful, beautiful bridge drawings from the peninsula by various Royal Engineer officers. Our archive has just recently reopened after a huge redevelopment, so please do get in touch and we can get you booked in and see some stuff.
Brilliant. So lots for folks to follow up on. Sam, this has been fascinating. Thank you again for joining me.
Folks, before you go, do me a quick favour. Like the episode, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you found it. Perhaps star it if that's what your particular podcasting platform allows, and share the word with somebody else who might be interested. Whether that's a case of hitting share so that your friends know about it, or just simple word of mouth. You know, if you've got a colleague or a friend who's going to be interested in this episode, just pass the word on to them, send them the link. It all helps to grow the channel. If you're on Apple Podcasts, and I happen to know that 50% of you are, you can also think about leaving a review. Hopefully a favourable review, but be honest. And if you're interested in going a little bit further, as you know, you can leave one-off tips. So that you can do that via Ko-fi, the link is in the description, or you can become a regular supporter via Patreon. There are all kinds of perks, from discount codes to voting rights and much more in between. To say nothing, of course, of the shout-out that goes in each episode, and the opportunity to be part of the Napoleonicist Discord channel, and the chance to have one-to-one meetups with me for the Emperor-level patrons. I'm also unveiling, in the run-up to the new year and the decision to go to 3 episodes a month, up from the usual 2, I'm unveiling a new tier, the Marshal-level patrons. The Marshal-level patrons get everything in the Commander and Mentioned in Dispatches, tiers. So that is the shout-outs, the voting rights on the themed months, the discount code from Pen and Sword. But on top of that, they will get the chance to dictate some of the future content. So for every 3 months that you're a member of the Marshall tier, you will be able to request an episode on a topic of your choice. Now, there are sort of parameters around that. It needs to be something that people are going to be interested in. So, you know, asking me to do an episode on your great-granddad who served in the War of the Sixth Coalition probably isn't going to be feasible. It also needs to be something that is genuinely researchable. But within those obvious parameters, and I'm not going to kind of interview you, so, you know, publishers and authors don't think that that's a bright way to get yourself on the podcast. But within those fairly reasonable, I hope, parameters, you will be able to request an episode of your choice. So if you're interested in that, take a little look at the Patreon link to find out more, or to find out more about all of the other levels on Patreon. As ever, a big shout out to my patrons, my Emperor level patrons, Mark Stoos and JC Kaiser, my Commander patrons, Goa Brown, Jane Davis, Marcus Cribb, Matt Bone, Bob Burnham and Stephen Gillen, and my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Alexandra Leon, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, Anonymous Canadian, Gareth Copeland, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brennan, James Bevan, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, John Haynes, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatler, Lynn Dawson, Mark Dewhurst, Rob Griffith, Rory Muir, Ross Flowers, Ryan Diamond, and Stephen Coulson. I'll be back soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleon Assist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Even on a budget, quality is non-negotiable. That's why Quince is the place to score high-end essentials at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Get your hands on buttery soft cashmere sweaters from just $60, Italian leather jackets, and so much more. And the best part about Quince, they exclusively partner with factories committed to safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Elevate your style without the elevated price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns.